Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Before I speak, I'm going to say something. I am so honored to be here at Boston College at this sponsored, Melinda, by this wonderful program that you have going wherever you went. Thank you so much for your welcome. And to have that introduction by Father Tom Kane, who is one of my dearest and oldest friends. Tom and I, to give you one example, visited Generalissimo's Franco's tomb together. And when I produced a play in 1974 at the Berkshire Theater Festival, Tom produced its Boston production. Tom, I'm forever in your debt. It's a great pleasure to be on your turf with you and to have this welcome. I want to speak seriously with you tonight. Those of us who are Catholics know that this is a moment of epiphany for our church, a moment of catastrophe. Catastrophe, I would want to say, in the sense that Aristotle uses the word in the Poetics. You know that in Greek, this is BC, I have to cite the Greek, right? You know that in Greek, catastrophe means turning point. And the catastrophe that we're all a part of as Catholics is a significant and ultimately, I hope, a positive turning point. But in a way that may surprise you, I want to talk for the minutes I have as a lecturer before we have I hope, a robust conversation. I want to talk about the old days. I want to talk about the stakes of Catholic renewal. I want to say something a little bit outside the box within which we usually discuss our ongoing struggle as Catholics to keep the faith and change the church, to use Voice of the Faithful's slogan. I want to insist that the world and the very future of the human species urgently needs a reformed, humane, self-critical, fully democratic Roman Catholic Church. It is not a parochial question that only belongs within our argument, but it's something on which huge historical pressures depend, and therefore it's gravely serious. And to do this, I'm going to actually ask you to take a trip down memory lane with me. I'm going to give you a litany of a few years, and I'm going to suggest both what they meant to me personally and hope that my own personal story can illuminate the Catholic story in a way that brings freshly to the surface what's at stake in Catholic renewal. So I'm stepping back from the present scandals, and in a way it's important that we do that. We can get caught in the scandal mongering. We can get caught in the day-to-day series of dark revelations. It's very important for us to have in mind what is going on and why it matters. 1943, 1945, 1950, 1953, 1958, are you still with me? 1960, 1961, 1962, 1963, 1965, and then boom, 1966. And a lot that follows from that I won't have to elaborate. Some of you were alive in some of these years, and some of you weren't, but I'd like to invite you to go back in time with me. 1943 is the year in which the Niagara current that is running below the surface of American life was generated, a current taking us toward a great cascade of catastrophic fall. In January of 1943, 5 things happened of significance, 4 of them monumental, one of particular interest to me. I was born The week I was born, four other things happened. I'm going to sound like a narcissist here, but it's part of the function of being a writer. If you're in a room with the door closed trying to draw out of yourself words, narcissism is an occupational hazard. But in January of 1943, between January 15th and January 22nd, my actual birthday, four other things happened. In Casablanca, Roosevelt and Churchill were meeting, and they made two momentous decisions. One, they launched Operation Point Blank, which was the first time the American Army Air Forces and the Royal Air Force jointly began to bomb the cities of Germany. Until then, the American Army Air Forces had refused to cooperate with the British Bomber Command out of regard for their own preference of precision bombing over British area bombing. In truth, precision bombing was more mythical than real because of the imprecision of bomb sites and so on. But the American flyers insisted that one had to draw a distinction between civilian and combatant victims of bombing. And that distinction ceased being drawn. The first American attack on a German city from the air took place at the end of January. It was led by a young Air Force officer named Colonel Curtis LeMay. The other thing that happened at Casablanca was Churchill and Roosevelt agreed at the end of the conference that from then on, the American policy toward the enemy would be one of unconditional surrender, something that Churchill actually opposed because he was afraid that in the endgame of the war, unconditional surrender would drive the enemies into a catastrophic resistance, suicidal and ultra-destructive resistance, which in fact was the case, especially in relationship to Japan. And the third thing that happened that week was the laboratory in Los Alamos opened. Unconditional surrender joined to unconditional destruction. And the fourth thing that happened that week was the opening of the Pentagon, which marked the movement of moral agency away from individuals to a bureaucracy. Moral decisions by the United States military made less by individuals than by a mass impersonal bureaucracy. These things combined together to begin something wholly new in American life, to generate a force that had momentum of its own, transcending the ability of any individuals to control it, sometimes even to notice it. And that momentum is the ground of American life to this day. And that's my subject. 1945, that momentum accounts for the otherwise debatable decision to use the atomic bomb at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. In truth, President Truman was getting on a toboggan that was already halfway down the hill, as he put it himself. His decision, in a way, was no decision. There was already a momentum at work that made it almost inevitable that the United States would bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki, even though in hindsight we can see that there was no authentic moral justification for that bombing. It did come in the context, after all, of a massive strategic bombing of Japanese city with conventional weapons that had already killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. In the last 6 months of the war, the United States, operating from the air, killed something like 1 million civilians when the war was already effectively won. Not because of evil or wicked intention, but because of this momentum that I'm describing. This momentum is what people of faith have been looking for ways to stand against ever since. Let me elaborate. But before I do, I have to also note that 1945 is the year in which Auschwitz was liberated by the Soviet army. And although it would take years for the full import of what had happened to register on the human imagination, this was the revelation, the epiphany, the catastrophe, the laying bare of the horrors of the anti-Jewish genocide. In 1950, the year began with news at the end of 49 of the Soviet Union's having acquired an atomic bomb, which generated a kind of panic in the American people, symbolized by a new religious movement led by a young evangelical Protestant minister by the name of Billy Graham, who had his first great crusade that year. And the crusade movement, an important point of reference, the crusade movement began that year. A religious Christian nationalism began to grip the American imagination. Better dead than red. In our competition with the Soviet Union, we began to think apocalyptically, taking for granted a theology of God, that God saves the world by destroying it. And lo and behold, we began to do that ourselves as we began to accumulate a nuclear arsenal that transcended any rational possible purpose. In 1950, there were 200 atomic bombs in the American nuclear arsenal. In 1960, that number had grown to 19,000, mostly hydrogen bombs. Why? No one thought we needed that many bombs. Not even Curtis LeMay, who presided over the accumulation as the general in charge of the Strategic Air Command. It was an insane, mad accumulation of nuclear weapons, and it defined the Cold War. Through those years, of course, some of you remember the apocalyptic paranoia. Remember, apocalyptic imagination opposes good and evil, divides the world and reality into polarities, us against them, no distinctions to be made, no subtleties, a radical Manichaean division of the world by virtue and wickedness. That defined the Red Scare. It defined our panic about communism. It defined our embrace of public Christian religion as a nation. That's when we put under God into the Pledge of Allegiance. President Eisenhower himself was baptized in the White House. The prayer breakfast began as a regular routine of the president and through the president down the chain of command of the U.S. military, a tradition that continues. President Obama presided over it only 6 weeks ago. President Obama doesn't believe in the prayer breakfast, I presume to suggest. He could no more do away with it than he could take the American flag lapel out of his jacket. It's a feature of American life, and every command in the military imitates it, with young GIs and soldiers and troops effectively required by their superiors to worship in this Christian way. 1953, I said a minute ago that people of faith began to look for ways to resist this all but explicit religious absolutism that was gripping American life at that moment. That was the moment when the most, I would argue, one of the most, if not the most significant American religious moments of our history took place. And I remember it. And it had something to do with where we're sitting here tonight, because that was the year that then Archbishop Richard Cushing excommunicated Father Feeney for teaching no salvation outside the church, a religious affirmation of absolute and clear superiority, a religious affirmation of full rejection of any kind of pluralism, a firmly Manichaean, us against them, religious affirmation. We are saved, you are not. And I remember it because this was my first theology lesson. I used to lay awake in bed. My first experience of religion was a kind of existential dread, because the presence of God was very vivid to me. I was a religious boy. In 1953, I was 10. You already know that. And I can remember laying awake, alive to the presence of God in my room, but also alive to the doom that God promised. Not me so much, but Dickie Babb and Peter Sisman, who lived on either side of us. Dickie Babb, a Protestant. Peter Sisman, a Jew. I didn't know much about what a Jew was. I knew that Jews had killed our Lord, but that was pretty much it. And I knew that they were both going to be condemned to the lake of fire for all eternity. And I knew what hell was. Sister made it vivid to us. Hell is the infinite experience of pain with the capacity to feel it infinitely. And I remember actually getting my mind around that double infinite. And it was vivid to me, and I was anguished about Dickie and Peter. So when one day the Monsignor tells us in class, I remember vividly, that the Archbishop of Boston had excommunicated a priest for teaching no salvation outside the church, I was astonished. I went home. I said, Mom, they excommunicated a priest for teaching no salvation outside the church. My mother said, I know. And I said, but I thought that's what we believed. And she said, it was. And I said, what do we believe now? And she said, we believe live and let live. And something began to move under us, especially then when the Vatican, Feeney, of course, he was in his element. He knew he had Cushing dead to rights because he had 1,000 years of church teaching behind him, and he appealed the excommunication to the Vatican, and the Vatican upheld the excommunication, upheld Cushing on a technicality. They didn't rule on the theological issue. They ruled on Feeney's disobedience. But nevertheless, something was moving under the ground of the Catholic Church. Some of you remember this shift. There was a kind of attempt to protect no salvation inside the church by curious ideas like baptism of desire. Well, actually, they're in the church. Anybody who wants God's will is actually a Catholic. They just don't know it. But when they get to heaven, they'll find out they were Catholics. But I mean, there was this gymnastics to accommodate a change. Where was this change coming from? Post-Hiroshima, post-Auschwitz. The cost of religious absolutism that was rejecting of other people was becoming very clear. And Catholic Christianity was resisting it. I would argue, by the way, in large part because of experience Catholics had had in America. It was in America that people could take offense at the preaching of a Father Feeney on the Boston Common. And you know, of course, why Cushing took particular offense, because of his brother-in-law, Dick Pearlstein. And you remember the Pearlstein brothers ran Louis, and they used to take their lunchtime strolls on the Boston Common and hear Feeney. And then Cushing would hear what Feeney was preaching at his sister Dolly's dinner table on Sunday. And he knew one thing. Dick Pearlstein is a good guy. And if I love Dick Pearlstein, it's inconceivable to me that God doesn't love Dick Pearlstein. What is that? It's an affirmation of experience over doctrine. Experience over doctrine. It's an American idea. And Cushing was the first person in the Catholic Church to go public with it. In 1958, Angelo Roncalli was elected Pope of the Catholic Church. And he was different. He, as you know, was almost the only Catholic prelate to actively participate in resisting the Holocaust. As papal legate in Turkey first, where he provided hundreds, perhaps thousands of birth certificates to fleeing Jews. I can hear the objection. But, Your Excellency, the birth certificates are lies. It's not true. They aren't baptized. This is a lie. You can hear the answer. On the scale of what's happening, the lie doesn't matter. And then, at the end of the war, he was made papal legate to Paris, where one of the things that immediately involved him in conflict with the Vatican was his response to the discovery that there were hundreds, perhaps thousands, of Jewish children who'd been hidden with French Catholic families. Some of them, many of them baptized. And Roncalli instructed local Catholic officials to, where possible, seek out their families or anyone who would be willing to be responsible for them in the Jewish community and return those children to their own communities, for which he was rebuked by the Vatican. John XXIII saw up close what had happened, and that experience changed his attitude toward dogma. It was out of that experience that he called the Second Vatican Council. Where did the council come from? It came from the Holocaust. It was a response to the Holocaust. It was a response to the Christian failure embodied in the Holocaust. Yes, the Nazis did it, but they could not have done it without the centuries-long tradition of Christian anti-Judaism. And the broad culture could not have been silent or complicit without that same long tradition. And John XXIII saw. In 1960, one of the defining experiences of my life, talking about experience, took place in the winter when, as a senior in high school, because my father was a Catholic big shot in the United States Air Force in Europe, we had a private audience with the Pope. The greatest moment of my family life, my parents' proudest day. And I had my own momentous experience when the small Pope came in front of me. He stood in front of each of us, my four brothers, my mom and dad, my grandmother, and he pulled me down to him. I was the height I am now, and I loomed over him, and he pulled me down to him, and he whispered in my ear. And I would love to tell you what he said, but I have no idea. I don't even know what language it was. But it changed my life. Until that moment, I had been firmly committed to follow my father into the Air Force, an Air Force flyer. 1960 this is, the year of John Kennedy. It's a time to be a patriotic American Catholic. It's a real time to love your country and to want to serve it in the military. And I maintained that ambition. But John XXIII had seared me in some way I couldn't explain. A few months after his meeting with me, there I am, the narcissist, John XXIII met with a French Jewish historian named Jules Isaac. And Jules Isaac, who in 1948 published a book called Jesus and Israel, in which he presumed to suggest that Christian anti-Semitism had its roots in the New Testament, and for which he was roundly denounced by Christians or ignored. In truth, I had never heard of him. Most of the people I knew had never heard of him. John XXIII had heard of him, invited him to the Vatican. Isaac reported later that he presented the Pope with his book. The Pope said, "Thank you, I've read it." And he received the copy warmly, Isaac said. And it was a few days after that, in June of 1960, that John XXIII instructed those who were preparing for his council to put the church's relationship with the Jewish people at the top of the agenda. And you can hear them. The church's relationship with the Jewish people, what's to study there? But he knew. Experience over doctrine. In 1961, in the summer, Act 1 of the great American nuclear crisis took place, the crisis over Berlin. In June of '61, Kennedy met with Khrushchev, in Vienna. He came back from that meeting and confided to New York Times reporter James Reston off the record, Khrushchev kicked the shit out of me. Khrushchev told him that if the Americans didn't clear out of Berlin, it would be war. It would be war that winter, he said. And Kennedy showed us that summer how afraid he was. He went on television in July to announce a sudden new American war footing. Some of you may remember that was when he announced a major crash program to build bomb shelters, a major program to prepare the population for nuclear war. He announced a major increase in the draft, and he announced, amazing, a tax increase to pay for an urgent buildup of the military. Kennedy conveyed his fear and dread to us that July. My father, working in the Pentagon, conveyed his fear and dread to me like this. He called home. We lived at Bolling Air Force Base, next door, by the way, to then Air Force Chief of Staff Curtis LeMay. And he gave his driver the night off and asked me if I would come and pick him up. And I did. And driving home from the Pentagon late at night, it wasn't midnight yet, because at midnight the lights in the Capitol flashed off, and I know that the lights were still on. And I drove across the city, and my father said, out of the silence, I'm going to tell you something once. I want you to ask me no questions about it. Mom knows, but you should know. One of these nights, I may not come home. If that happens, I want you to get Mom and the boys in the car. Get on Route 1. Drive south. Go to Richmond. Go past it. Keep going. Yes, sir. Well, of course I knew what he was telling me. It was insane. I later understood. Drive to Richmond. Richmond is on the way to Newport News and Norfolk, Virginia, the largest naval establishment in the world. If the Soviets were going to hit anything, they were going to hit Newport News and Norfolk, and we were headed for it. My father was not being rational. Even if we were to survive the dreaded blast, survive for what? And as what? And in what? It was just like Kennedy telling us to build bomb shelters. That was irrational. It was crazy. It was an expression of desperation and fear. They were letting us see how afraid they were. That's why this country bonded with Kennedy the way it did, I believe. And that experience absolutely blew the United States Air Force out of my vocational life. A few days later, sitting at the breakfast table, I said to my father, I think I'm looking for a way to give myself to the things that last. And that could only mean one thing to an Irish Catholic kid. And I began to look around Georgetown for a way to do that that would fit with me, and I found the Paulist Fathers. I assumed that religion was the opposite of war, that religion was a way to push back against war. Of course, my education in those years taught me that religion is implicated in war. Religion was implicated in the war against the Jews, which I began to learn as a seminarian. The deputy, the amazing worldwide reckoning with the Holocaust that began to happen in those years, the trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem, and the horrifying discovery that I made in those seminary years that Christianity, including Catholic Christianity, was complicit in what had happened to the Jewish people. But I also saw alive an impulse to reckon with that and to do something about it. This is what makes the Second Vatican Council the most significant religious event of the century, because a revolution from the top took place. People at the top said, we have to look at very basic things about our tradition. Look at what we have been part of. And in 1962, so that's my next year, the council opened. I was a novice, beginning my life as a Paulist. I didn't know much. I knew that we weren't allowed to watch television. And suddenly the novice master hauls the old Philco into the common room, and we're going to watch television. What are we watching? The opening of the council. And and we were instructed to understand that something momentous was happening. We didn't really get it yet. How could we? The pomp and circumstance. I remember, however, the speech that John XXIII gave at the opening session. It included, "You prophets of doom," an attack on, we later learned, the Curia itself. People who are only looking at the negative and not the positive. And the church has to be alive in the world. The document doesn't say the church and the world, which is the Manichaean frame, the bipolarity. It says the church in the world, Gaudium et Spes, the church in the world. That was what the revolution was about. The world is good, very good. And then astounding things began to happen. Cushing's repudiation of no salvation outside the church became doctrine in the promulgation of Dignitatis Humanae, which said that every human being has supreme obligation to pay attention to conscience above church membership, which meant you didn't actually have to be a Catholic. And if your conscience told you not to be, you shouldn't be. A revolution in theology. But most momentous, Nostra Aetate, of course. Why? Two things, of course. The Christ killer myth, renounced forever. Something as basic to us as the Gospels. The Jews are not to be held responsible for the murder of Jesus. And not only that, in the Latin, the document uses the word electionem, the chosen people. God does not repudiate the promises God makes. The covenant God made with Israel is full and complete and permanent. Hello? You don't need Jesus to go to God, much less the church. If you're a Jew, the covenant puts you in relationship to God. This is the most profound theological revolution, I would argue, as a non-theologian, as a thinking layperson, in the history of the church. And many, many people understood it as such, especially including Jews. And what is that? It's a pushback against the world condition that is now armed with nuclear weapons. The readiness to define the other in demonic terms. The good versus the evil. It's a repudiation of that bipolarity. It's affirming pluralism. It's affirming the equal interaction of every human person. And the most important thing for my purposes about the council is what else happened the first week. Because lo and behold, the novice master brought out the television again. Within days. To watch what? To watch President Kennedy telling us we were on the edge of the nuclear abyss. And it was at that moment that John XXIII intervened with Moscow and Washington both. And in Pravda, the Soviet newspaper, the headline read, "Pope makes a plea for all humanity." Khrushchev wanted the Soviet people to see him responding to the plea from the Pope. The Council Fathers saw the importance of a church authentically, relevantly engaged with the real world as it is. The Niagara Current, remember, 19,000 nuclear weapons in our arsenal, a few thousand in the Soviet arsenal. Hair trigger. ready to explode. And it was after that that the Council Fathers, reconvening, repudiated the Curia's draft of the document on the liturgy. And they established their own committee, replacing the Curia, their own committee to draft a new document on the liturgy, which included the revolutionary ideas that define the liturgy as we live it today. And when that happened, John XXIII, watching on closed-circuit television, turned to his companion and said, "Now begins my council." The council is what it was because those bishops, too, stood on the edge of the nuclear abyss. Nuclear dread is one of the elements on which the urgency of church renewal still stands. Pacem in Terris, 1963, the Pope's last will and testament, published only a few weeks before he died, in which he dares to suggest that that it is doubtful, quote unquote, that nuclear weapons can ever be an instrument of justice. Not the Soviet nuclear weapons, all the nuclear weapons. I was astonished. And as if they were in sync with each other, a few weeks later, John Kennedy made that same point in his profoundly important speech at American University in June of '63, in which he said, the Soviet people are not the only source of tension between us. We have contributed to this impasse also. Not good versus evil. We are all in this. And then, of course, the profound experience of mortality. As if I needed it, a brush in my face, the face of all of us, of the importance of the things that last, when President Kennedy made the experience of mortality so vivid to us. And when, by the way, the American and world people understood for the first time the power, the majesty, the healing character of the Roman Catholic liturgy. In 1965, with the promulgation of those magnificent Vatican II documents, and also with the arrival in New York City of Pope Paul VI, to make them, as if they weren't clear enough what they were about, to make them dramatic, unmissable, when he went before the General Assembly of the United Nations and gave that speech that ends, "Jamais plus la guerre, jamais plus la guerre." And what war was he talking about in 1965? He was talking about our war. Lyndon Johnson was enraged. Cardinal Spellman was humiliated when the Pope did that. And between Pacem in Terris and Kennedy's AU speech and Paul VI's statement at the United Nations, one powerful wing of what we call the peace movement was ignited. A week after Paul VI's speech, a young Quaker named Norman Morrison drove to the Pentagon from Baltimore and got out of his car with his baby. At the last minute, put his baby aside, poured gasoline on himself, and set himself on fire below the window of Secretary of Defense McNamara. As it happened, my father's window was on the same corridor, half a dozen windows down. That was the first week of November at Thanksgiving at Bolling Air Force Base, the first time I saw him coming from the seminary at St. Paul's College. I said to my father, what did you think, Dad, when that man set himself on fire? And my father, I later understood, had been traumatized by it. But he expressed the trauma by, "That kook! When will the enemy stop? We all want peace, right? Yes, sir. Does encouraging the enemy to think that we won't carry this to the end encourage them to stop or keep going? I could never debate with my father. I said, keep going, I guess. So was that an act of peacemaking, or was that an act of prolonging the war? Religion and violence. The United States of America has been grappling movingly, powerfully, publicly with war and war-making all these decades. We have gone to war again and again, and every time we as a people have felt torn about it. We are not cavalier about it. It's not incidental to us that since Pacem in Terris, the formal offices of the Vatican, of the Catholic Church, from the Vatican down, have opposed America's wars and invited Americans to think more deeply about them. But even now, we understand how the grip of a massive military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower called it, how that grip continues to hold us and how it threatens us, so that even an unlikely candidate like President Obama, no war impulses in him, it can be swept up in it. His magnificent attempt to rein in nuclear weapons, we're in the middle of it right now. His spring attempt to rein in nuclear weapons. And here's hoping Americans listen to him. The world hears him. That's why he got the Nobel Prize. In America, that made people cynical. But the world gets it, what he's up to. What is he up against? He's up against that same Niagara current. $700 billion, the bailout money, such a point of dispute among us. Every year, $700 billion appropriated with mundane regularity for the Pentagon. You know this. The attempt to resume nuclear arms control and reduction, one of the most precious public events of the current moment. The attempt to think about others in less than Manichaean terms. We were gripped so powerfully after 9/11 by that old Cold War habit, us against them, good against evil. We're right, they're wrong. No self-criticism needed on our side. And you see where it got us. We, the Catholic Church, have such urgent importance for the human species as it grapples with this problem. 1945 is the beginning of the epoch that's defined for the first time in our lives on this planet, defined by the human capacity to make our species extinct. And that is the single largest question before us. And we hear it discussed now. But religion of all kinds is a crucial element in this reckoning. Islam and Judaism, the war in the Middle East, the war in Israel, whether Palestinians and Israelis can possibly find the way out of the corner. They are locked in a corner. Guess what? The walls of that corner were built by someone else. Who? Us. The West, Western civilization, the two twin traditions of anti-Semitism and Orientalism, imperialist colonialism. much of it constructed in the name of Jesus, and America in the grip of Christian nationalism, which has infected our military forces like a virus. Will the Roman Catholic Church be a fundamentalist institution going forward in this century? This profoundly unfundamentalist tradition, which has valued above all the rational character of faith. Science comes from our tradition. Galileo, Copernicus, a priest, faithful men whose understandings of the world they got in rooms like this. The false dichotomy between science and religion. Will the Catholic Church be a fundamentalist institution, frightened by modernity, defensive, retreating into that bipolarity, us against them, but not only that, nature against supernature, the world against the church, now against the afterlife, Jesus against Muhammad, all of us against the Jews, religious people in a coalition against secular people. It isn't, in other words, only about who can say Mass or how bishops are held to account for their choices. It isn't just the preference for democratic structures because one is a Democrat. The preference is for self-critical accountability so that we can all understand that we are all flawed. We all need the forgiveness of God. None of us is perfect. There is no salvation outside the church. That's over. And yet it isn't over. Because an inch below the surface of what's been happening in our church is a will to return to that uncritical absolutism. And it's not happening. And that's, of course, the point of this catastrophic revelation that we're living through. The vestige of the old order destroying itself shamefully. We're properly concerned, we're properly hurt, and we're properly worried. But it isn't only for our lives as Catholics. It isn't only for our ability to hand on this good tradition to our children. It isn't only to fill our churches or to get priests, men and women, priests, to get lay people running the church. It isn't only that so-called reform agenda that's at stake here. What's at stake is the future of the human species. Nuclear dread, and now environmental degradation. Will we do what we have to do? Let me just say, I have never felt the power and importance of the Catholic Church and my small place in it more than I do now. The Church demands our faithful struggle to resume and continue its renewal. I started by citing 1950. Forgive my somewhat nostalgic trek down memory lane. But in 1950, some people already had a feeling for what was at stake. I want to close by reading from William Faulkner's Nobel Peace, Nobel Prize in Literature address. I decline to accept the end of man. It is easy enough to say that man is immortal because he will endure, that when the last ding-dong of doom has clanged and faded from the last worthless rock hanging tideless in the last red and dying evening, that even then there will still be one more sound, that of his puny, inexhaustible voice still talking. I refuse to accept this. I believe that man will not merely endure, he will prevail. He is immortal, not because he alone among creatures has an inexhaustible voice, but because he has a soul, a spirit capable of compassion and sacrifice and endurance. The poet's, the writer's duty is to write about these things. It is his privilege to help man endure by lifting his heart, by reminding him of the courage and honor and hope and pride and compassion and pity and sacrifice which have been the glory of his past. The poet's voice need not merely be the record of man. It can be one of the props, the pillars, to help him endure and prevail. I believe that. I believe it about the poet, but I also believe it about the Catholic. I believe it about the Catholic. By reminding all of us of the courage and honor and hope and pride and compassion and pity and sacrifice which have been the glory of our tradition at its best. And no, we don't need to be reminded of what it's like at its worst. We need to be reminded of what it's like at its best so that we can be worthy of it and claim it and make it happen again. Thank you.